My name is Rabbi Annie Lewis. I'm Associate Rabbi of BZBI. We are so grateful this evening to welcome as our teachers, Drs. Danny Holtz and Craig Franson, for our program on rethinking white supremacy and anti-Semitism. We're in a moment in the Jewish calendar that is the saddest time of the year, as we are going to observe later this week the day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, where we commemorate many tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. And when I first learned about the work that Danny and Craig do, this seemed like a powerful opportunity in this moment in the calendar to learn from them about white supremacy, about anti-Semitism, about ways we all can work on turning things around in our world, ways we can create a world where there is no longer hatred, which has caused so much damage. So I'm grateful to them for being here with us, and especially in this time in the Jewish calendar, to help us reflect on where we are, on where we've been, on where we might want to go. I want to share a little bit about them, and then I will turn it over to Danny and Craig. Danny Holtz is a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for the Humanities at Oregon State University, where she's developing an interdisciplinary anti-racist citizenship curriculum. An American historian specializing in ideology, conservatism, and white supremacy, she received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2017. She has an edited volume on ideology and U.S. foreign relations under review and is currently finishing a manuscript on U.S. conservatism in the 19th century. Craig Franson is an associate professor of English at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, specializing on the political legacies of British Romanticism. He writes and teaches on nationalism, humanitarian rhetoric, critical theory, and contemporary popular culture. He received his PhD from the University of Oregon in 2007 and is former director of university writing at LaSalle. He's currently writing a book on J.R.R. Tolkien's appropriation by the far right. So we are so grateful that Craig and Danny are here. We will have about 2 hours to spend together with ample time for questions and learning. And I should also mention that Danny and Craig are our neighbors and part of our BZBI community in Philadelphia. So Danny and Craig.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our living room. We're going to be having a kind of intense conversation today. So there's a couple things I'd like to foreground. One is that we're going to be talking about the history of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. These are topics that are incredibly powerful and also incredibly disturbing. So remember to breathe. If you begin to feel yourself tighten up, a little twist. Remember that the things that are happening in your body while we talk through this is part of the structure of white supremacy that makes you feel that way. So I really want to foreground you attending to what's happening in your body and also taking care of your body while we talk through these questions. So I'm going to talk about the antebellum formation of white supremacy as an ideology, and Craig is going to talk about the far right. But we're going to start with a 3-minute clip from the Dick Cavett show in 1968. So Princeton philosophy professor Paul Weiss and writer James Baldwin have a conversation about the best way to create social justice and equity, to put it broadly. So Weiss is going to raise objections to Baldwin's focus on race. And what I want from you guys when you watch this is to attend to what those arguments are. Why does Weiss object to focusing on race? And what does he imagine is the alternative? So David, if you'll share that video for us.
Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum here.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. There's all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability. And the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by the society when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country with one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu, I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than it already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn up all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, it's the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
So while Craig sets up the PowerPoint, I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into that moment, and then I'm going to take you back to the 19th century. We're going to talk about a bunch of 19th century history, and then I'm going to bring you back around. That's our plan. So Weiss's critique of Baldwin in this clip is that for Weiss, becoming a man means neutralizing race and connecting through his individual labor. Baldwin's point in response is that it's impossible for him to connect through labor because you cannot labor if you're dead. Right? So what's really at stake for Baldwin is Black lives. Did you share it? Yes.
Yes. There you go.
All right. So basically, when Weiss asks, why must we always concentrate on color? He's saying, basically, stop being black, right? You need to identify with other elements. This identity is a thing that you're using to separate yourself from the rest of society. And if you identified with your labor, that would be something that would bring you together with other people. And Baldwin is responding, you won't let me. So Weiss says, stop being black. Baldwin says, you won't let me. Black people have never been allowed to be race neutral. So if Baldwin's point here is, I can't stop being Black, then the question for us is, why is that true historically? Why, and also why can't Weiss acknowledge it? Right? Both of these positions are connected. That James Baldwin cannot stop being Black, that white society will not let him just become a man, and that Paul Weiss cannot talk about it. What is so dangerous about talking about Blackness? So to begin to answer this question, I'm going to take us back, as I promised repeatedly, to the antebellum era. And I'm going to look at the longer history of white supremacy and the function of white fragility and anti-Blackness in the debates over the states, and crucially, in the admission of new states. So, when I talk about white fragility in the antebellum era, I mean it in two senses. The first is, So I'm going to be talking about the function of white fragility and anti-Blackness in the debates over the admission of new states. Right now we're looking at Missouri, but also crucially the controversies over state sovereignty in pandemics, which is essential to understanding the formation of Blackness in the 19th century, but also the ways that white supremacy becomes codified in law, legislation, and also ideological practices. All right, so when I talk about white fragility in the antebellum period, I mean it in two senses. The first is the sense in the historical record that white people faced distinctive dangers and that it was a fundamental constitutional imperative for the US to protect those white people, first and foremost, at whatever cost. So for example, when Missouri and Florida apply for statehood with constitutions that exclude free people of color from in-migration, white Southern statesmen defend those constitutional provisions on the grounds that Black liberty posed a unique danger to white settlers in those territories. When those states, when their respective states pass quarantine laws that also criminalizes Black liberty, they insist the alternative is the mass murder of white citizens. So on the one hand, there are these policing laws and constitutional provisions that exclude free Black citizens from coming into US states. And on the other hand, there's this argument that if that doesn't happen, then white people will die in massive numbers. So in Congress and in the courtroom and across the frontier, this white fragility, this form of it, eclipses all other considerations. The rights of citizens of color, as I mentioned, but American diplomacy, the Constitution, the Union, everything has to be sacrificed. It's kind of image of white security. And not only do white Southerners assert a seemingly boundless power to police citizens of color on their land, but their white fragility in this context shielded them from accountability. So once they reframe any particular issue as a question of their basic survival, once pro-slavery Southerners signify enslavement as, quote, the essential principle of their very organism and indissolubly interwoven into the very framework of their being, end quote, then they treated discourse itself as an aggressive attack on their lives. Every time legislation touched on enslavement, even elliptically, Southerners amplified their alarmism, setting more severe boundaries on what topics are safe to discuss in mixed company, in this case, North-South. For pro-slavery politicians and their allies, the only thing more dangerous than the exercise of Black liberty in public was talking about Black liberty in politics. And that brings us to the second meaning of white fragility in this frame of analysis, the one you might be aware of because there's been a lot of discussion of this work and its theoretical tools. So in this sense of white fragility, I draw on Robin DiAngelo's understanding of white fragility to encompass a sociology of dominance that results from white people's socialization into white supremacy and provides them with the means to reproduce its totalizing system of control. So the fragility here is the mechanism of that control, which primarily operates through silencing and erasure. In this sense, white fragility is not just about the projection of risk onto bodies of color, or even the elimination of all discourse about their subjection. It's about projecting something that requires the complete erasure of its own precarity to exist. In their totemic expressions of white fragility, pro-slavery politicians embed this kind of tacit acknowledgement that they exist in precarious conditions, right? These precarious conditions in the 19th century US are driving their expansion and intervention over US boundaries, US borders, and that's a lot of what's causing the political tensions in the United States this period. But in the wake of these conflicts, they don't describe the dangers attendant on occupation or settlement or colonization in primarily material terms. Instead, they describe them overwhelmingly in terms of their white fragility. What's the greatest danger they face in relation to these territories? What danger most absorbs their time when they're talking about it in Congress or in letters to their friends? The danger to white people of not having the ideal conditions for their personal liberty as they defined it to settle wherever they pleased with whatever resources they required without limits, including, of course, the stolen resources of enslaved people's labor. And it's this form of white fragility that pervades the congressional record, the seemingly pathological incapacity of generations of successive legislatures to talk about race without devolving fundamentally into a defense of white privilege. This process resolves itself by recasting the problem in terms of white needs and then foreclosing further debate in an increasingly hysterical fashion. In the end, in politics, white fragility works itself out in the form of a taboo. The political expression of white fragility ensured that US foreign and domestic policy alike hinged on the exclusive protection of white hegemony at whatever cost to the integrity of the country's institutions, its international standings, or the constitutional reach of its protections. So that's my thesis. And now I'm going to bring you into a couple examples to show you kind of how this works in US politics specifically, looking at Missouri and these South Carolina statutes and Florida, so that when you want to go with your friends and have a conversation, you guys can be specific. I like that. All right. So when Missouri statehood stalls in 1820, because its constitution prohibited US citizens of color from settling there, the political debate consistently turned from the salient question of racial discrimination against citizens of color to the danger that Black liberty posed to white people in the South. White Southerners advocate for the Missouri's provision in Congress as a kind of essential act of what they call self-preservation against the inherent danger that free Black people posed to Missouri's white populations. This is the argument. Citing the state's control specifically over quarantine regulations, white Southerners exerted an expansive state power to protect white citizens from all, quote, dangerous contagions as a matter of public health, including entire classes of people made dangerous by the color of their skin. So during the 3-month-long controversy over Missouri's constitution, Southern statesmen refused to condition Missouri's entry on its equitable treatment of Black citizens because in their terms, free people of color were even more dangerous to white Southerners than people afflicted with pestilent disease. At a brief note, I'm using free people of color quite often. It's because in the language, free people of color is the most commonly used referent for what we would now call bi-POC. And so you're going to hear me use that a lot, except for when the color is especially relevant, the Black people, white people contrast. All right. So because the state's power must be constructed so that it can protect its own morals and its own safety, according to one congressman, excuse me, Southern states must be allowed to exclude any population that threatens both its safety and its morals. And the argument is that free people of color inherently do this by the nature of their presence in states that have enslaved populations. So similar laws to Missouri's restriction are already on the books in Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Maryland, South Carolina, and Delaware. It's a long list. But admitting a state with such a provision in its constitution gave this discriminatory practice the cover of national sanction. So all the states I just mentioned came without that kind of clause in their constitution, and they put it in afterwards. And so it wasn't the federal government approving. Over the next 20 years, more than a dozen states passed versions of these preservative statutes. So within a year of Missouri's admission, South Carolina moves to criminalize free Black citizens whose vessels drop anchor in South Carolina's harbors. The first effort to make it, actually, I need the PowerPoint. It's the first effort to make it illegal for citizens of color to dock in a state. It also offers the first opportunity for citizens of color, it also offers the first opportunity to test the Southern doctrine of self-preservation in federal court. So the state's advocates in this case are employed by this private organization of Charleston's elite. There we go. There we go, that's the, so the South Carolina Association, which forms for the express purpose of imprisoning Black people for the crime of freedom. In our Southern community, they wrote, they can scarcely exist, quote, there can scarcely exist an evil of greater magnitude than the moral contagion of free Black people. In spite of the headaches the law's enforcement caused, and there was a lot of headaches because it created huge diplomatic problems. It's not just free citizens of color in the United States, it's any sailors of color. So a lot of British sailors got wrapped up in this. So it becomes a huge State Department issue. So in spite of all these problems, and the fact that local law enforcement does not really want to enforce this law because it causes them a lot of problems, the South Carolina Association argues that nothing could give the state's white inhabitants greater security than quote, to prevent any free colored person from any part of the world ever entering again into the limits of the state of South Carolina by land or by water. You can tell they meant it because of their use of capitalization and italics. So defending the law in U.S. Circuit Court, this attorney, Benjamin Hunt, he argues that the state could no more divest itself of this statute than it could, quote, lawfully commit suicide. In terms of the law, he argued that South Carolina's quarantine of free Black seamen was no different from New York's quarantine of Charlestonian sailors who'd been exposed to yellow fever. There had been a huge yellow fever pandemic in 1819, 1820, 21, and 22. So across this period, they're dealing with an actual pandemic where these quarantine laws are relevant. And if anyone wants to talk about South Carolina's quarantine laws and how they apply to Black people and not white people, we can talk about that in the question and answer period. Don't have time for it now. So in terms of public health, Hunt argued that South Carolina had much more reason to believe in the moral contagion that New York's Black seamen introduce than the importation of yellow fever, end quote. The power of this ideology that we're describing is vested in its duplicity. White people should not be quarantined because diseases aren't really contagious, but Black people must be quarantined, or in this case imprisoned, because Black liberty always was. And unpoliced Black liberty was as deadly for white people as a global pandemic. Again, I'm talking about the rhetorical construction, what his argument is, not the reality. So from the state's position, from South Carolina's position, the real danger to the country was not this virus that had just wasted its port cities. It was the moral contagion of free Black people that threatened exclusive white power. The law's ideological commitments were apparent in its penalties. Spectacle of arresting free people of color, that is, taking them bodily in chains from their ships the moment they docked, reinforced the white public perception of their inherent danger, and it essentially criminalized free Black labor. It eliminated public Black liberty in the South, and it disincentivized merchants from hiring free Black seamen in the North and overseas, because they would end up paying these fines to get their sailors out of jail and also covering the costs of keeping them in prison for that period. So Like Missouri's statute, South Carolina's Black Exclusion Act fails on its merits, but it remains in place on a technicality. And afterward, the tide of jurisprudence turns towards this kind of domestic police power that's beginning. So when we talk about policing, we often talk about kind of the KKK roots of it, or how groups of people formed posses to hunt down fugitive enslaved people. But the other aspect of it is that the domestic police power was one of the few areas where the states had power outside of the federal government. Quarantines are under the policing power. So this is the power that begins to be expanded in terms of especially public safety and public health, because it was the way they could get around the federal government and also federal national treaties with foreign nations. So the Supreme Court supports the state's authority immediately the following year in Gibbons v. Ogden, basically saying that they can pass whatever laws they need to if it ensures their population's health and public safety. And then in an 1832 opinion, Attorney General Roger Taney, who later is the writer of the Dred Scott decision, explicitly affirmed South Carolina's right to exercise whatever police power it determined was, quote, absolutely necessary for its own safety, and specifically to guard themselves from the danger to be apprehended from the introduction of free people of color among their slaves, end quote. So the real fear here, the real contagion here is liberty, right? In the mid-1930s, pro-slavery forces combined in Congress to enact some of the most restrictive legislation on free speech in U.S. history, including a federal gag on discussing enslavement in the House, and an attempt to place the Postal Service under state jurisdiction, which would allow the states to censor any media that crossed its borders. If any of that sounds familiar, we can talk about it after. In 1837, the Supreme Court empowers the states to take precautions against, quote, every description of persons who might endanger the public safety. Justice Philip P. Barber, who argued in favor of Missouri excluding free Black citizens as a congressman in 1820, wrote in the majority opinion that the states had as much right to guard by anticipation against moral pestilence, all in quotes, as they had to guard against the physical pestilence which may arise from the unsound and infectious articles imported or from a ship the crew of which may be laboring under an infectious disease. In effect, this jurisprudence defines a state's security by its capacity to police free Black people and other dangerous groups like poor immigrants, and white citizenship by its invulnerability from those people. All right. So when Florida submits a racist constitutional provision that's nearly identical to Missouri's in 1845, every motion to add the same restriction as Missouri's failed. The 1820 debate over Missouri's constitution stretched over months and required a special joint committee to resolve it. The 1845 Senate debate over Florida's constitution lasted one Shabbos afternoon. Referring to the precedent set by Milne and the Southern Self-Preservation Acts, white Southerners argued that exclusion was a necessary precaution to, in their words, avoid such a form of plague as visited Saint Domingo, which is, of course, a reference to the Haitian Revolution and the Black Republic in Haiti, which means that what they're arguing is that exclusion is necessary to avoid the plague of Black liberation. Several senators revived the exact arguments they made on behalf of Missouri's Black exclusion 25 years earlier when they were mere congressmen. For example, Virginia's William Archer, who was a congressman in 1820, is now a senator. He says, so long as they suspected that emissaries of, quote, colored men from the North threatened their states with insurrection and murder, white Southerners were entitled to treat their vessels as if they were carrying, quote, yellow fever or the plague on board. Before sunset on that Saturday, Democrats and Southern Whigs joined to admit Florida unconditionally. And the same day, President Taylor signs a bill annexing the enslaved Republic of Texas to the United States. Everything changes in this moment. after Florida and Texas are admitted, there's no longer any space where Southern white settlers could reasonably extend Black enslavement. Between Florida's admission in 1845 and the debate over Oregon's disposition in 1848, the US gains roughly the same amount of territory that the British East India Company controlled in India at the time. And all of that territory had already established organic laws that prohibit enslavement. So while the country's legal and legislative regime that we discussed earlier is turning more explicitly in favor of Black enslavement, its geopolitical demographics seem to be shifting against it. The geopolitical demographics of the country seem to be shifting against it. We can stay here. Sorry, that's an attention deficit disorder moment, guys. There we go. Okay, so you have this kind of legal legislative regime that's turning more explicitly in favor of Black enslavement. You see that kind of results in Bleeding Kansas and in the Dred Scott decision and the earlier jurisprudence we talked about, some of which is explicitly about Black enslavement and some of which is not. But at the same time, there are these demographics that are changing and pushing against the power of that particular party. And advocates of Black enslavement no longer have a gag rule to protect them from political scrutiny and consequences. So you'd had this gag rule implemented that I talked about earlier in 1836. It's rescinded right before Florida's admission. So part of the problem is that they're in this moment where they're feeling like they're going to lose political power, and they want to create the conditions, the ideological conditions, where they're no longer politically precarious, white Southerners. So they respond to this predicament they're in by turning every discussion they have into a referendum on their personal freedom. Without the privilege afforded white Northerners to emigrate to these new territories without constraint, white Southern slaveholders argued that they became something less than white, an inferior and degraded being, in the terms of one senator. White Southerners insisted that any boundaries on their freedom to bring enslaved people into the new territories called their political status into question, reducing them to a condition worse than Black enslavement because they would be white, but politically marginalized. So in other words, their whiteness is so fragile that they respond to any restriction on their liberty as an attack on their citizenship and their survival. Again, back when Missouri applied for admission to the Union in 1820, the political debate consistently turns from the salient question of racial discrimination against citizens of color to the danger that Black liberty poses to white people in the South. And by the time that California reaches that threshold 30 years later in 1850, Congress would no longer suffer a conversation that remotely touched on enslavement, let alone the rights of free Black citizens, without sending members into paroxysms about the erosion of Southern white privilege and the danger to the Union. They made Black liberty taboo in the halls of Congress and reserved the expertise of white Southerners. The political debate revolved instead on the danger of curtailing white liberty and specifically white supremacy in these resource-rich new states. Now I'm gonna give you guys a bit of a conclusion and bring it back to James Baldwin and Paul Weiss. So the white supremacist ideology of white fragility rejected any kind of precarity for a select white population, and it envisioned their total invulnerability as the purpose of state power. In the structure of Southern self-preservation laws, the domestic police power criminalized public Black liberty as a form of implicit violence against the state. In their execution, the state's public display of force equated the experience of Black liberty with the public spectacle of violence, which justified the state's preemptive police power over all Black people. And again, we'll be talking about Portland and what's happening in other cities when we hit the question and answer and when Craig Franson talks about the alt-right. So these self-preservation laws ensured that free Black people would not be visible in Southern public spaces. And for a time, the gag rule ensured that their concerns would not be represented in federal politics or in federal political spaces. White lynch mobs at the same time ensured that Black people would not have any voice in popular literature or in the press. So over the course of these 3 decades, white fragility completely evacuated the ideological space for Black people to have unpoliced liberty, let alone access to their constitutional privileges. At the same time, white Southerners fought to remove all conditions on white liberty and all restraints on white police power, all while advocating for a constitutional guarantee of white superiority. Perhaps whiteness, in this case, must be defined by its negative space, its motive an act of erasure. This perspective suggests that the act of assimilation must always be a continuous process of collective erasure and self-abnegation, because to become white must be to negate the facets of collective selfhood that distinguish one's group from whiteness, and in their place to fill up that space with white men, and in this case, their insecurities. So returning back to the clip, what we have in this instance is James Baldwin speaking with a white philosophy professor from Princeton. If you'll excuse me for a moment, there's a bunch of sirens. I hope everyone can still hear me. Police state, so. All right, so in watching this clip, it's hard not to see examples of the kind of dynamic that I'm describing historically, right? This kind of defensiveness, a desire to erase out James Baldwin's Blackness and discuss ways that we connect beyond color, as if James Baldwin is somehow stuck in this space. But there's something that changes this, which is that Paul Weiss was known to his family as Parrots Weiss, and he's a white Jewish philosopher who was at Princeton. And so what I wonder is what changes when we find out that the white person in the scene is a white Jewish person. Does that change our understanding of what's happening in this moment? So when James Baldwin is talking about going to Paris in 1848 and about how safe he feels there, how does Paul Weiss read that? What's the impact on him considering 1948 in Paris? This is the problem of being a 19th century historian. 1948 in Paris is not a safe place for a Jewish person. That anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism are historically co-constitutive, that they don't have the exact same kind of effects, but they're implicated in each other because they're both supportive of this overarching system of white supremacy in which Jews are also accountable because of their whiteness and their embodiment of white supremacy in these kinds of spaces. So when Baldwin talks about the white Christians, right, he's having a conversation with a person who 100% agrees with him about the exclusionary space of a white Christian nation. But the function of white supremacy here is that it prevents them from being able to have a conversation with each other from their perspectives. That Weiss is saying basically, this process worked for me. I'm now unmarked by race. I have unmarked myself. I am just philosopher, white philosopher. Weiss cannot form a coalition with Baldwin, and also Weiss is not safe in this moment. So all that positioning does is to isolate him and keep him precarious, and it makes his precarity illegible. It explains both why Baldwin can't have the kinds of conversations, and we can also talk, there's a lot of incredible work by James Baldwin on white Jewishness and how that fits in the ideology of white supremacy. But in this moment, it explains both why Baldwin can't do the thing he seeks to do, and also the thing that Weiss is asking, why he can't just be a man, and also the cost of white fragility for white Jews. Right? White fragility operates by erasing free Black people and discourses of Black liberty from the public sphere. And there's an element of this about specific to Weiss's precarity and how Weiss gets used by white supremacists and white nationalists. And that brings us to Craig Franson's portion. Do you want to sit here?
No, this is fine. I'll just turn this a little bit.
If everyone's take a moment and breathe a little bit. And then Resmaa Menakem, who's a very, very brilliant scholar, works on trauma and the embodiment of trauma, specifically trauma for Black people. And he suggests doing a twist to the left, just a gentle twist, and looking over your left shoulder. And then a twist to your right, looking over your right shoulder.
That did loosen up my chest.
Yeah, and now we'll talk about the alt-right and white supremacy in this moment.
Okay. So I think you can set that down. All right. So as I'm setting up my slideshow and putting it up here, what I want to do is just give everyone maybe 30 seconds or so. If you have a notebook handy or something like that, jot down any questions that you have, because my talk is going to veer off and jump ahead by about 100 years, and I don't want you to lose the questions that you're forming about Danny's talk right now. So take a sec, jot down anything you need, and I'll jump back in a moment. All right, so to start, let's see. So to start us off, I think what I want to do is talk really briefly about specifically what Danny was referencing with Paul Weissman at the very end there. Paul Weiss at the very end there. Just looking today online, Danny turned up an article from 1978 from Instaturation magazine, where Paul Weiss is identified as one of 6 Semitic mind benders who are working on a mind control plot to control the people of the United States on behalf of the Zionist occupying government. Probably you won't know what this journal is, but Instauration magazine is the kind of chief magazine of Wilmot Robertson, who is the creator of the Christian identity movement, the Christian identity theology, which becomes the Aryan nations. And the Aryan nations movement, of course, is the synthesis of neo-Nazism and Klan ideology through a kind of theological wash from the 1970s. And it continues on forward to our own day. And so the way that we found this article is that it gets reposted on William Pierce's National Vanguard magazine, which is the main neo-Nazi magazine, in 2016. And it's republished in 2016 by Bradford Hanson. Sorry, this is kind of a long walk, but I'm getting somewhere. It's published by Bradford Hanson of the American Vanguard, who is one of the big neo-Nazi leaders. And it's reprinted again in Truth to Power by a man named Charles Bousman, who lives in Lancaster and is one of the main kind of neo-Nazi recirculators and aggregators of news. And so this is a person who in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, has this journal that's online that works in tandem with the Russian government to advance a kind of pro-Putin white supremacy in the United States. And this takes us really to Pennsylvania and the kind of white supremacist scene in Pennsylvania in a kind of roundabout way. So I think it's worth noting that Paul Weiss really does have a particular kind of threat. He is being noted by the neo-Nazi movement in this period. All right, so I'll put my screen back up here so that we can kind of talk through this a little bit. So I'll be looking at what I'm calling specifically the alt-right cult in this, and I'll work through that terminology in just a second here. So what Danny has been talking about and what several people in the questions that you have been asking about, we might categorize in one way as liberal racism. That's the racism of the liberal system, right? Kind of official policy, official governmental liberal policy. So a few ways that you can look at this. One is structural or systemic racism, the kind of inherited structures that we have from the 19th and 20th centuries. The more contemporary version of neoliberal capitalism, this kind of neoliberal consensus that welds left and right together under the idea that democracy is money, that capitalism is freedom. Another one that's connected to that, this colorblind racism that we've kind of talked about with white fragility, this notion that if you get rid of color, that you can, if you get rid of color in some kind of way, everybody is equal, and that creates a kind of racism. And then finally, a kind of co-opted activism. And this is one that we can talk more about at the end. This is activism that takes energy from usually anti-racist movements that are focusing on black subjugation and steer it towards something else, right? Steer it toward LGBTQ rights or steer it towards some other kind of rights and kind of use the energy in some ways. And so these are different ways that liberal discourses get drawn into racism. What I'm going to be looking at a little bit more in my part of the talk is going to be illiberal racism, the kind of stuff that we're a little bit more familiar with once in a while, and the more scandalous side of this. So things like xenophobia, the white power movement, anti-Semitic conspiracism, and then of course also anti-Islamic hate groups, especially after 9/11, which kind of weld some of these things together in a slightly new configuration. So this is a source for that, and I can talk about this more a little bit later. Arlene Mondan and Aaron Winter are the writers who come up with this configuration. So just to look back at 10 specific years, between 2008 and 2018, more than 100 Americans are murdered by white supremacists, and the neo-Nazi site Stormfront, which is an international site, gains 900,000 readers internationally, and these are original readers, not multiple hits by different readers or by the same reader. This is 900,000 people visit the site, just to give you a snapshot. Below that, of course, this is the rally in Charlottesville, and the quote that they have that they're saying, Jews will not replace us. This is a phrase that we'll kind of be able to come back to in a few moments and think through a little bit. So in 2018, just one of those years, the last year there, 50 people are killed by far-right extremists in the United States. That's 100% of extremist killings. There were no other extremist killings that weren't far-right in the year 2018. A few of those are fairly familiar with us now. A Penn student who was killed in California for being gay and Jewish by the Atomwaffen Division. Parkland High School, Florida, of course, where 17 were killed and 17 wounded. The Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where 11 were killed and 7 were wounded. And the yoga studio in Florida, where a men's rights activist killed 2 and wounded 4 there. So the groups that were behind these different killings were militia members, white supremacist gangs, neo-Nazi organizations, and anti-feminists. And I think if I have the stat right, between 2014 and the present, there's only 1 year where anti-feminists don't kill people and don't have a mass killing of some kind. So that's another one that really is worth kind of keeping an eye on in this context too. So the questions that I'll be looking at here, first of all, are what are the far right and the alt-right, especially fascism and the alt-right? Number 2, what are the ideological roots of the alt-right? 3, how does it spread its ideas and expand the movement? This is often called punching above its weight. How does it have such a big imprint if it's not that big? And then 4, really briefly, how can we fight today's white supremacy and anti-Semitism, given the kinds of things that we're talking about in here? So first of all, we'll start with fascism. What is fascism? And I want to start here because this is actually a really hard question. There was actually a really good podcast on this today with a couple experts that were brought in. But for our purposes here, we're using a kind of minimal definition of fascism, where it's a right-wing species of popular authoritarianism that's rooted in a pangenetic ultra-nationalist cult. Now, we've got to define those terms a little. So first, pangenetic, that's a renewing or purifying movement, something that believes in purity. Usually the phrase born again is connected with this in some way because it's seen as a kind of spiritual awakening. Ultranationalism, that's a kind of nationalism that demands absolute purity. So total identification. This is where totalitarianism starts to come from. A total identification with and an allegiance to a sacralized, uniform, physical corporate body. And finally, the word cult that I want to draw out here to bring out the kind of sacrificial and conspiratorial elements of the religion, the civic religion that it depends on in those ways. So a pangenetic ultranationalist cult. So if we take that as kind of the core root of what fascism is, then, and this is coming from Roger Griffin, who's kind of the world expert right now on fascism. then we can also define the alt-right a little bit more clearly. And I would argue that the alt-right is an international, postmodern, neo-fascist cult that's trying to unify the global far right and establish a world full of patriarchal ethnostates with totalitarian governments. One way of describing this is as super-fascism, that it's not simply fascism on the national level, but it's an international fascism that is explicitly totalitarian. And I'm drawing a few people together there that I've cited at the bottom. So second, what are the ideological roots of the alt-right? And to talk through this, I'm going to cite a bunch of different things that we can draw out more later, but I want to give people some names and things that they can jot down if they're interested in looking at them. So there's going to be some lists here. So the first area that they get things from is 1830 to 1960s, the kind of mainstream white supremacist system that's in place, this kind of top-down authoritarianism of the state. So a couple of different things. First is the kind of legacy of the Old South with enslavement, Jim Crow, segregation, those kinds of things. Calhoun is a big referent for people in the alt-right. Secondly, and this is one for people in my line of work to really think through, is the Western canon, right? The national literature canons of the West. Specifically, continental philosophy, they love Hegel. Hegelian tradition is kind of one of the big things that they think through. Nationalism, specifically Romanticism that they're drawing on. Imperialist literature, they love Kipling. Kipling is all over alt-right areas. And also modernist literature. Ezra Pound is kind of one of their big figures, of course, but there's a lot of other kind of secondary figures that are in Italian futurism and things like that that they really kind of hold up now. The third category that we can think through is racist science. So especially social Darwinism and eugenics. And both of those movements, social Darwinism and eugenics, have a very contemporary spin to them. So they're not just kind of 1920s versions, but very contemporary versions that we can also talk about later. And then, of course, fascism. And there's a few things that they're drawing on. One is the organicism of fascism. Specifically, they're big fans of Nazism, so they reread and sell Nazi texts all the time. And also radical traditionalism, which is the more Italian spiritualist strain that comes from Julius Evola, a kind of mysticism of fascism. So the thing that happens, though, after the 1960s, of course, is the civil rights era. And this creates a big break for far-right movements in the United States. And it's really important to understand what happens from their perspective to see what they're doing now, because it really creates a transformation. So in the civil rights era, there's a whole series of legislations that are passed. The key one for them, though, is going to be the Voting Rights Act, because in their mind, the Voting Rights Act becomes the sign of a Jewish conspiracy by the Zionist occupying government that has kind of infiltrated, in their view, the US government and created a system that will use voting processes and demographics, basically, to replace the white population with a population of color that they view as necessarily immigrant, as a foreign population. So this is where that phrase, Jews will not replace us, comes from. Is this in the Zog conspiracy, this Aryan nations idea that the 1965 Voting Act creates an illegitimate state for the United States, and that the only way now in order to advance the white state is to operate outside the state, right? And so now they're going to be moving from this kind of old top-down position to a bottom-up position where they have to imagine themselves as victims and underdogs. And that's going to lead us to the 70s and 90s, when the white supremacist movements have this reorganization and resurgence, where they come back in a different kind of way. And really with an explicitly paranoid framing. So the image here, of course, is the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh, who is an Aryan Nations member connected to the militia movements, the Patriot militias. So two key differences here in the white power movement. So both of these together are white power. The white power, what we tend to call white power in popular parlance, is the National Socialists, the group that's the Liberty Lobby, that is a kind of like mainstreaming National Socialist organization. The Fourth Klan under David Duke, the Northwest Front, which is the kind of Northwestern Portland-based, this is one of the reasons Portland is in the news all the time, this kind of neo-Nazi organization that tries to create a white homeland in the Pacific Northwest, and then the skinheads movement. So this kind of explicit revolutionaries that want to overthrow the government by one means or another. That's the white power core of it. But then on the side, there's the second movement that has the same ideology, but they're pulling out. They don't want to have a revolution. Instead, they're going to be survivalists and try to outlive the corrupt state that they imagine. So this is the Christian identity theology movement. That gives us the Aryan nations, the Posse Comitatus group. This is the group that you see taking over the wildlife refuge in Oregon, the Bundys that are now living in Idaho, where I'm from, and trying to take over the state house out there. So that's the Posse Comitatus group. They're actually, if I remember right, the most dangerous from a law enforcement perspective. They kill the most police officers of any of these different groups. And then finally, the Patriot militias, which are connected to them. So that's the kind of reorganization of the movement. At the same time as that, there's an ideological turn that happens. This is the cultural turn in white supremacy. And so this is another one that we're fairly familiar with now because of Holocaust denial, right? This notion that you don't simply, if you're a white supremacist, try to overthrow the state, you try to steal culture, right? You try to have a culture war and steal the subterranean, right? They call this metapolitics. So a few things that happen in this cultural turn, a few groups they get their ideas from. The first is the European New Right. This is the kind of neo-fascist philosophy that comes out of France and Germany in the 1990s, a little before that too, but especially the 90s, and this kind of ethno-history that gets developed there. The second big field is anti-Semitism, which comes from a lot of different areas that kind of get pulled together. So first, and I think a very important one that people tend not to think about is anti-Gnostic theology. This kind of theology that views, it's usually Catholic in origin, a Catholic far-right theology that imagines that Judaism is Gnosticism and that Gnosticism is a materialism that's counter to spiritualism. And it has this whole kind of framework that imagines that Jews don't have a spirit, that they are bodies that cannot have a spiritual side. And that they're essentially tied to the devil in that kind of way. And this becomes a piece of the Aryan nations movement as well. And it really is kind of baked into some Christian theology in the Catholic Church, especially in the 1950s and 60s. Connected to that is, of course, Holocaust denial, the kind of industry that gets developed in the 1990s, the Zog conspiracy, the Zionist occupying government conspiracy of the Aryan nations. In the 90s, that gets watered down into the New World Order conspiracy. Pat Robertson, basically the evangelical minister Pat Robertson, who grows up next to the Aryan Nations movement. His father is a senator who kind of supports the Aryan Nations early in his career, or the pre-Aryan Nations group. He basically takes the Zog conspiracy, the anti-Semitic conspiracy, and takes the Jewish reference out of it and says there's a new world order of secret globalists who are trying to take over. He doesn't reference the Jews, but he keeps that framework in place. And that kind of gives a mainstream to these old conspiracy theories and shows and kind of becomes why they can spread so rampantly after the 1990s. The third group here is paleoconservatives, who we can talk about more later. There's a bunch of different groups there. These are kind of hard right conservatives from the 1990s. Pat Buchanan is kind of their poster boy. He's the one that made it into politics for them. And then, of course, libertarianism. Especially social Darwinism from early libertarianism, this thing that they call race realism that you see a lot in usually the tech community right now has a lot of that. Originalism is a kind of law philosophy that they often draw into or draw upon in the alt-right circles. But then also the funding operations that a lot of libertarian funders end up directly funding the white nationalist movement and funding the alt-right internationally. And so even if they're not ideologically a big part of it, in terms of the funding and organizational structures, they really are often connected to it. All right, so later we'll kind of come back to the anti-Semitic portions of this as we talk through this a little bit more. All right, and then the real turn to the alt-right is with technology. And so that, I think one of the ways of thinking about the alt-right is as an infrastructural move in the far right. It's a way of still doing culture, but doing it through algorithms and online kinds of communication strategies. So there's a few things that are important in the development of the alt-right. In the 1990s, there's this formation of white nationalist intellectual journals that become really, really important for them. In the 2000s, there's an important turn where Fox starts mainstreaming anti-Islamic hate groups and anti-government conspiracy groups connected to the Patriot movement. And so you have actual people who are connected to terrorists and connected to hate groups and in some cases connected to neo-Nazi organizations who are coming on Fox shows and getting airtime through these. Then in 2008, they really kind of amped this up by connecting explicitly with the Tea Party Patriot movement and really kind of mainstreaming the militia organizations connected to the Aryan nations. And this is also the year that they kind of coined the phrase alt-right to name what's already been happening. And I think that's a key thing to keep track of in this too, is the alt-right did not start in 2008. It got named in 2008. The alt-right is really describing a thing that's been in place since the 90s. And then in 2013 and 14, a really important turn is the Gamergate movement, where the Gamergate is this online movement about gaming and men in gaming. And it's basically a point where men who had been controlling video game culture forever brutally subjugated and kicked off the women who were producing video games and tried to move them outside of gaming. And so that really created the kind of contemporary troll culture that we have now. And this notion of swatting people, doxing people, creating giant mobs to chase them out of their homes, to torture their parents, to kill their dogs, all these kinds of radical online developments of hate that were created around anti-feminist groups and that then were turned into an alt-right movement and incorporated into the alt-right. And that happens in all kinds of official ways that we can talk about more if people have questions. Then the last two are pretty easy because this is where we start to see it a little more in mainstream. So 2015, of course, the Emmanuel Methodist shooting. In that, Dylan Roof writes a manifesto, and his manifesto becomes a text that becomes a model text for other mass shooters. And so this is where we see a kind of international alt-right movement, an international terrorism that takes American models for itself. And so really, if you're working in Germany or France on terrorism, you characterize a lot of these movements typically as American-born terrorism movements that are international terrorist organizations founded in the United States. And that really is kind of the root of part of this. And then, of course, 2017, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, where all of a sudden people were like, oh, there is a basket of deplorables. It turns out this actually is a thing that's true. And kind of mainstream culture catches up with what's been happening behind the scenes for a really long time. All right, and then again, we can come back to Gamergate if we want to think through the means, the kind of mechanisms that the alt-right uses. So this then takes us to the kind of intellectual portion of this that I'm going to move through pretty quickly. So how does the alt-right punch above its weight, right? How are they able to infiltrate the mainstream so effectively? Because they're not that big. So I think the key thing here is to think about the alt-right as a fusion, as a kind of fascist fusion of three different discourses and three different energies. So the one that we talk about a lot is white supremacy, the kind of racism that's baked into the alt-right. And a lot of journalists get it wrong by thinking that's what the alt-right is. That's always there. But the alt-right is also these other two key pieces. The other one is masculine domination at the bottom of the screen, this kind of fierce misogyny that's baked into fascism. And then, of course, the other one that really is important for us today is the authoritarian complex. And really, when I talk about that, I'm really drawing on the Frankfurt School, but also some contemporary psychology on authoritarianism, and especially anti-essentialism and the kind of paranoia that can develop in cultures where people basically want things to have clear essences. And the key with the authoritarian complex is that's the piece that drives conspiracy theory. That's the piece that kind of makes people latch on to these large, elaborate plots as this kind of essential component. And it's also the part that tends to get connected to anti-Semitism. And this is where I think it's really important to think of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism as being connected, but not exactly the same thing. They serve different functions in this fascist system. All right, so if we have these three fields of discourse, the place where they overlap, that's the alt-right, this kind of hardcore fascist center. And if you look at any kind of neo-fascist text in the alt-right, they'll have all three of these components. They'll be at different levels and they'll focus on different things, but these three things will always be there in some way. And then if you want to understand the alt-light, that's the kind of lighter mainstream version of these things, the gateways into these, that they're these kind of softer versions of each of these three discourses. And so if we look for a second at white nationalism, the way to get into white nationalism is to get into Western chauvinism, this idea that Europe is best, that the West is best. And so there's a whole discourse built around Western chauvinism that denies racism in order to draw people in. And then in the links, they'll send you on to the white supremacist sites, but they deny it up front so that you'll be drawn into this thing. Same thing if we look over, or if we look down to the manosphere. The manosphere is the name for this kind of really fierce masculine movement online that wants to subjugate women really, really violently. That movement, which is horrifying, as all these things are, has a much softer version that they call men's rights. Trying to get men to get connected to their feelings and just advance their own ideas and have a culture of themselves, that those things are a kind of front that leads people into the manosphere and the kind of darker stuff. Same thing for neo-reaction, this kind of authoritarian complex of this kind of hardcore fascism. There's a front for that is kind of the culture wars, these groups that pitch the idea that there's a big war going on, there's a conspiracy that you need to understand. Alex Jones is a big component of that. These people who kind of have conspiracy theories and draw you in and then push you in toward the alt-right in those things. So if we take each of these kind of separately, in the alt-right sector, there's a few groups that I have up here. These are some of the big names that are connected to white nationalism. So if you want, you can, if you have questions about what any of these are, I can come back to them later. The ones that you need to know in Philly probably are right in the middle of that box, American Identity. That's the group that used to call itself Identity Europa. And Identity Europa is one of the big neo-Nazi kind of, yeah, I'll just be explicit about it. They're neo-Nazis. They're an international neo-Nazi organization that is trying to infiltrate college campuses. And so we'll occasionally have their posters come up downtown in Rittenhouse. They've been active on Penn's campus. They've been active on Drexel's campus. This is the group that's really kind of wearing the khakis and trying to get neo-Nazism into campuses. And they're also the group that's been promoting the idea online and the conspiracy theory online that Antifa is trying to wage a war across the United States. And they've kind of been convincing police officers all over the country that Antifa is about to invade their neighborhood. And so militia groups will rise up, and you've seen these over the last couple of months all over the United States. That's the group that's been behind this. And then a couple others. These are all just fancy ways of saying either Klan groups, Aryan groups, or neo-Nazis in different combinations. And then some of the gateway groups, these are those Western chauvinists. So paleoconservatives, a lot of the paleoconservative theorists who are connected to fascism, some of them are actually the people who invent the alt-right. Paleo-libertarians, that's kind of the same thing, but it's a slightly different name. Anti-Muslim activists and anti-immigrant groups. Those are the kind of categories. And then if you want names for them, Turning Point USA is probably the biggest one that sends people into the alt-right, and it has been infiltrated by the alt-right. Breitbart News is, of course, one of the largest ways of getting people into the alt-right. And then, of course, Fox has also done it through their pundits and the people they bring on television. So I'll move faster through these other ones. So for neo-reaction, this kind of authoritarianism, there's a group called Dark Enlightenment Intellectuals, and this is the circle of I don't want to call them philosophers because they think they're philosophers, but they're not. This is a group of kind of techie, Vladimir Putin aficionados that are circled around Peter Thiel, the tech guru Peter Thiel. And they have a lot of power. They have this idea that modernity is bad and that you need to just crash modernity and start over. And so the basic idea here is that after the other side of a giant race war that will collapse the United States, these little monarchical fiefdoms will come up around the tech gurus. And so people like Peter Thiel, who have a ton of money, will buy land off the coast, build their own little kingdoms, and then once the United States collapses, they'll have a kingdom somewhere else. And so they've all kind of created this idea of a kind of monarchy, post-contemporary monarchy. So this is, and they're all kind of connected to that. So the softer ways into this, of course, the academic, again, soft academic journal Quillette. This is one that Jordan Peterson and several other people around him write for. This is a group that kind of sends people into the dark enlightenment and connects with that. Radical Christian Traditionalists, Gateway Pundit, Pizzagate, QAnon, all of those groups send people into the alt-right. And then the final group with the manosphere, I'll just note a few things up there. These are more obscure. And then the people who send them in, usually these are YouTube personalities. Milo Yiannopoulos is the most famous of these. But there are a lot of people that kids run into on YouTube ranting and raving about women on these little private channels, and then they'll send people into the manosphere. All right, so this is just a couple pathways that we can look at for how people come in. So if you have someone reading Steven Pinker, the linguist, Steven Pinker unfortunately left linguistics behind a long time ago and started writing bad tracts celebrating European history and arguing that the West is the best system in the world and that it's superior to all other systems. He became a kind of hero for the alt-right and became connected to Jordan Peterson, who's a little further in the men's rights organizations. If you click on them for a while, you'll start getting pushes sending you to Vox Day, who started the Gamergate movement. And Vox Day is in direct dialogue with Andrew Ehrheimer at the Daily Stormer. And within 4 clicks or 4 moves, you can end up in neo-Nazism. And so this is one of the ways that algorithms and social media tend to drive people in fairly quickly in this kind of radicalization. There's another path that I have up here to show how somebody can come from kind of mainstream evangelicalism with somebody like Pat Robertson, who teaches that there's a New World Order conspiracy. You can go pretty quickly now from Pat Robertson to the kind of anti-vaxxer and anti-COVID-19 conspiracy stuff that leads you into QAnon. And QAnon is directly connected again to the Daily Stormer. So coming from either of these directions, pretty quickly you can end up right in the heart of international neo-Nazism online. And then the last model that I have is Breitbart. So the way that a big organization like Breitbart works, their articles kind of span the entire alt-right. They really have this kind of discourse that will hit every single one of these issues. But the ingenious thing that Breitbart created was unmoderated chats. And so in the chats, after every article, you'll have all of this online discourse where people will then post the links to their neo-Nazi websites. And so if you're looking at any one of these stories, scan down a little bit, and all of a sudden you're back into the middle of the mess again. And they just left those up. I thought that after Charlottesville, they'd remove them, but those have been up for a very long time. I haven't looked this year, but they've been up for a very long time. So that's one of the reasons that Breitbart is kind of the king for this. All right, so the last thing is a very quick one, and then I'll send us into the question and answers. So how do we fight this, right? How do we fight this system? And at the most basic level, I think there are a few things that you can do. The first one is to get smart. Find authoritative sources and get educated on this stuff. And really the easiest places to go are Southern Poverty Law Center and Western State Center. These are the 2 organizations that really have a kind of holistic view of this kind of stuff. So they don't just focus on a piece of it, but they kind of tend to draw it all together in some ways. The next thing, and this is more for people online, don't engage with it. Instead, report it and block it. Deplatforming is the best thing that you can do. One of the most important things that happened in the kind of history of mainstreaming of white supremacy was when Geraldo Rivera brought, I forget who it was that he brought on, but somebody in the skinheads movement basically that he brought on. And his idea was that if we give it air, that's a disinfectant, right? Sunlight is a disinfectant. So if I show it on TV, people will see how stupid it is and how dangerous it is, and they won't go there. And instead what happened is I think the movement grew by a factor of 10 within that year. It massively promoted the skinheads, gave them huge avenues across the United States. It's been a terrible thing. And that tends to happen over and over again. And the worst thing that people tend to do now is really, unfortunately, people online on Twitter will repost things with a link to the source and rant about it. And then what they've done is all of a sudden given it way more hits, made it way more popular. People click on it again. And what you end up with then is leftists who are actually spreading far-right ideas. Because the more you click on it, the more powerful the algorithms promote it, right? The more powerfully. And then the last one, instead, engage in massive nonviolent protests. This is really the most effective way to oppose this. It has been since the 30s. And I think that the key thing that happens here is that you display their insignificance. If they're online, they seem huge. They know how to use that system, and they have really big friends in really high places in the tech world. But if you put them in a physical environment and surround them with a giant crowd, that shows how tiny they are. But the key is it has to be nonviolent, or else it actually plays into their narrative and equalizes things again. And then the next part of that is help to amplify their inner tensions. These groups typically hate each other. They have really big inner tensions about who should be running things, because they're all fascists and all totalitarians. And so they end up really kind of destroying each other over time and really fighting. And the best way to bring them together is to fight them physically in the street. As soon as Richard Spencer was punched at Trump's inaugural, that re-solidified the movement, and all of a sudden he became a hero. And he had not been a hero before that. And so finding ways to actually separate them is really, really important in this fight. So a few sources are up here, and I can get to these later and give you some reading and things like that if people are interested as you come back in the Q&A. But with that, I think I'll let you go ahead and take a second if you need to and jot down some questions. And then Danny and I'll just chat with you for a while.
Hello.
Let me stop the share. So, David, do you want to jump in and moderate some questions now, or how do you want to do this?
Sure. We've actually got about a dozen questions at this point. I'll start with questions to clarify some of the things that you covered in the talk. Susan Zealander asked, how did South Carolina deal with black slaves who arrived by ships or were already in state? Because you described a situation where they were trying to keep blacks out.
So these statutes are exclusively about free black people. They're not about slaves at all. So enslaved people are allowed to cross the boundaries. If there were enslaved people on this ship that there was a free black person also aboard, the free black person would be imprisoned. One of the repercussions of not paying your fines was to be sold into slavery. This is actually relevant to the quarantine aspects. The legal logic, the legal fiction they use to justify these laws in court is the quarantine regulations. And the judge points out when he rules in this court thing. Sorry, guys, white supremacy, you know? When he makes this ruling, he basically points this out, that they're using quarantine law to say that free black people have this kind of inherent contagion that will cause violence and destruction, and that the best way to handle that is to imprison them and then to sell them into enslavement and send them into the population that supposedly they would infect. But the way that mechanism actually works is that they're only dangerous when they're free. That black people, once they are enslaved, are no longer dangerous. And you have to have both. And this relates, I mean, if anyone's a doctor and wants to talk about the biomedical theory, this relates to kind of theories of contagion and biomedical theories in the period. So they kind of do this little sleight of hand, because Charleston doesn't have quarantines in the yellow fever epidemics. They decide not to because it's bad for their commerce, which, you know, also sounds familiar. Did that clarify the question? Good.
Okay. So Stanley Silver asked the question, were there any others in the white world at that time who were not inherently racist?
So I would say that racism inheres to a system. It's an ideology. So the question itself, the idea like, are there white people who are not racist? I'm not sure that it's a question. I think I understand what that question is asking. So I'll try to answer the question that question is asking, which is, we all live in a system that was built to reinforce white supremacy on a wide variety of levels, explicitly in the history. In the in politics and in jurisprudence. So
in theology.
Yeah. So it's not the question of whether a person who lives in a white supremacist system is or is not enacting white supremacy, I think is much more a question of whether or not they are spending every day of their lives trying to fight the white supremacist system in which they live. So I would say racism doesn't inhere in people, it inheres in a system. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
Neil Sussman asked a question. So Greg, this one's for you.
Okay.
We know about the right-wing authoritarianism and anti-Semitism, but what do we know about the left-wing progressive anti-Semitism, and how do we deal with that?
Wow, that's something that I worry about and wonder about every time I watch late night television. It is a real problem. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is other than to point it out to people, I think. Because I think there's a key difference, which is that white supremacy on the right, at least on the far right, is explicit and baked into the ideology, that it's what it's based on. It really is kind of a core concept that can't be divided from it. On the left, I would argue, at least in the last 50 or 60 years on the left, it's not foundational in any kind of way, and that it actually goes against the ideologies, and that specifically leftist ideologies, if you're looking at what the right would call, what the right often calls fascism, if you're looking at like cultural Marxism or any of those kinds of things, they often are connected to Jewish history explicitly and to Jewish philosophy. And so I think that looking at the left's notions of anti-Semitism is often it's about pointing out accidents. It's about pointing out people who mean well and don't know enough and act really badly. And so I think,
well, could I just also,
yeah, and please add in too. So, because there are other bad actors also on the left.
But also like anti-Semitism like racism. So when I keep saying white supremacy. So let's talk about white supremacy for one second. White supremacy is this larger ideology that includes all of these other components. It's an ideology that normalizes a particular kind of idealized white Christian cis het able body. Anglo-Saxon. And we can go into the details about like European organic nationalism and Kant and Schiller, and we could talk about the intellectual history of it and how it relates to the biologicalization of race in the 19th century. That's a whole aspect of this. But I think it's really important when we're thinking through like anti-Semitism and racism, that these are all functions of this kind of larger white supremacist system, right? So the anti-Semitism that we see on the left is in part a function of the ways that Jews haven't, I think, developed a discourse around, white Jews in particular haven't developed a discourse around themselves, right? That we're struggling with an ideology of white supremacy that requires us to serve this function over and over again. And that because we don't have a conversation, we don't understand necessarily anti-Semitism to be systemic or structural. We haven't had those conversations necessarily in the public sphere. Then when it comes out on the left, I think there's a lot of anxiety about calling it on the left. And this idea that like it's just not seen. And I think that that's very much about not having a conversation about what it looks like and why it's a problem.
Yeah, and I think if I could add a little bit more to this too, to take an example of this. So a couple years ago, when Ilhan Omar was singled out for having made some anti-Semitic comments or used anti-Semitic tropes, one of the things that happened is when people jumped in and called her on that, those attempts, those notions, those exclamations that she is anti-Semitic also played on the far right. And so neo-Nazi websites put them up all over the place. Neo-Nazis love using the trope of anti-Semitism as well. And so the thing that we have to realize is that when we do these things, when we call people on their anti-Semitism, that also doesn't get us out of feeding the white supremacist system. that we end up having to do a bunch more work to try and separate that from this, and it's a big mess on those kinds of things. So all of that is to say it's really hard, and I think that it's hard in large part because of taboos, that it's really hard to talk about.
Yeah, that both Blackness in America and particularly Jewishness across the board, right? The way that Jewishness has been made white in the international imagination, and also the ways that white Jews have created a kind of white Jewish space, white Jewish monolithic space, and then what that then does, right? If anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness are two essential component parts to a structure of white supremacy, which historically that it is, then the question becomes, how do we create a space where we have conversations where it's not about, it's about looking at the ways that Jewishness can function, white Jewishness in particular can function as a site for people to understand the way that whiteness is historically constructed, right? That's the figure that Jews play historically, this kind of, white Jews play historically, this middle figure that imagines itself to be conversant with a bunch of groups. And that part of the first couple steps that we take have to be about imagining a space where all of the people we want to be heard can feel safe being heard in that space. That we create something beyond what we currently have. I'm getting really abstract, guys.
We've been talking for a while. Yeah, but I think that one thing to focus on the left is tropes. That the thing that I see most frequently over and over again is people on the left that will cite an example of someone wealthy who needs to be taken down, and they happen to be Jewish. And that's the piece that we need to be better about educating people on. That kind of knee-jerk thing that we see all the time on late night television now. That
you think of something specific?
I'm thinking of nothing right now, but like on the Colbert Show, on like a bunch of different things.
You're thinking of Stephen Miller stuff.
The Stephen Miller stuff. There's a new comic book that you haven't seen this yet. There's a new comic book that just came out from some far left press that's attacking neoliberalism, and they have a big demonic figure of a Jew on the cover. I forget who it is, but a Jewish writer of economic theory. I forget which one. And it's horrifying, and it's mainstream, and it really is the kind of thing that we have to call out because it's terribly anti-Semitic. So I don't want to minimize that problem. It is there, and I think in Britain it's unfortunately even worse than it is in the United States. But again, it's not systematized in quite the same way on that side, and so it's a different kind of fight.
Yeah.
Okay. So there were a couple of very good questions asked by Alan Luxembourg, and Alan, since you are here, I wonder if you'd like to ask those questions yourself, or if you prefer that I ask for you.
Okay. My most recent question was, there doesn't seem to be any room in your outlook on Western chauvinism for people who believe that the West has made a unique contribution to the world. Are they all Western chauvinists?
I think, no, not necessarily. I think I want to differentiate between people who argue for any kind of ethnic individuality or unique imprint, as opposed to people who argue for the inherent domination of a group. So by chauvinism, I mean people who declare quite proudly, the West is the best, the West needs to rule, shut up and go home to everyone else. It really is a very imperialist kind of group. And so by the alt-right, I don't mean just anybody who teaches literature like me, British literature or something, but specifically groups that argue that there is a single thing called Europe. Not that there's French people and German people and different kind of ethnicities, but that there is an ethnicity that is European, which really just means white. And so it's a real sleight of hands. The Western chauvinists that I'm talking about are people who use the word culture for race. Mm-hmm. Stuart Hall has a really good article on this from the 1980s, where he talks about the floating signifier and the way that the word culture in the new racism that comes about with David Duke They start using culture as a word to make them safe, so they don't have to say race anymore, but they still mean race. And so I do mean a kind of very specific group in that.
Well, I guess the question I had sent in advance of this talk was the question whether you would consider Donald Trump a white nationalist. But from what you said so far, it's as if every white person is a white supremacist by being part of a system that has white supremacy baked into it. So if that's the case, then it doesn't really matter whether Trump is a white nationalist, because everybody's a white nationalist who's white. From the way you have described your point of view.
I think that's an easy thing to see in this, and I think there's a real insight in that. I do want to emphasize the systemic notion over the individual notion.
Yeah.
And I do think that to some extent, to me, it doesn't matter if somebody is or isn't a white nationalist in that kind of sense, because the way that you fight it is by fighting a system. And so to some degree, it's not terribly useful. But I do want to hold on to the ability to call certain people right? To refer to them by their ideology, because there are huge degrees of difference in this. And so I think that for someone like Donald Trump, I think the best defense that people often give for is he a white supremacist or is he a fascist is, no, he's too disorganized. That no, he thinks too many different things. I don't know how to make that cohere in a single philosophy. Certainly he's racist. Certainly he's misogynist. Certainly he has done things that are fascist. Over the last couple months, there's a pretty broad growing consensus about that in the academic community. But I don't know why that needs to inhere in his person, specifically because he's so dependent on other people and systems around him to make decisions and to do things, that I'm not totally sure what we gain from that. And I think to quote Sam Moyne, who was on a radio program today talking about fascism.
It's on WAMU.
On WAMU. Columbia's Sam Moyne talked about how it's politically counterproductive to call him a fascist, because it does, in the larger discourse, it mobilizes opposition more than it mobilizes people fighting for Trump more than it mobilizes people fighting against Trump. And so I do think that there are tactical reasons not to call people a white supremacist often and not to call them a fascist. Does that...
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, does that kind of get an answer to what you're saying? You seem dissatisfied, and I don't want to project too much.
Well, it does and it doesn't, because I'm just concerned that I come at this issue in the belief that there is an element of systemic racism in our society, and that's what the George Floyd murder has awakened white people to. Mm-hmm. But to say that the society is embedded in white supremacism and doesn't have all these other good aspects to it, in effect, I think almost hurts your argument, because who's going to buy that?
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. First, I'd like to shift your framing a tiny bit. What we're saying is that not that the society is embedded in white supremacism, but that white supremacism is embedded in the society. There's nothing natural about wanting to dominate other people. But I mean, I'm a historian, so I don't like to naturalize things. But there is something that happened historically that naturalized that normalized that kind of system. So when I say that racism or white supremacy are structural, I'm not being flip about it. I'm thinking, for example, that the quarantine law I'm talking about, that is also related to the enslavement laws and Black exclusion laws, that's all still good law. That's still legal precedent. There are current cases that cite laws that refer to property in enslaved people. That's still good law. So part of what I'm saying when I'm saying it's structural and systemic is a very material reality of laws and legislations that are on the books. But the other thing is to say, I'm not sure where the good bad comes out in terms of the society or the United States, right? Because only if we imagine that this white supremacist system that we're describing that's constructed historically, if that's the same as the United States. But I'm not sure that it has to be. That's only describing the kind of non-erased parts of history. One of the reasons I put so much emphasis on the people who aren't represented is because those people are also speaking. They're just not represented in politics, in mainstream politics. But those people are also building the United States. Those people are also part of what it means to be the United States. Right? It is a mixture of the colonizer and the colonized. And also, I think, specifically as Jews, right, if we're thinking about it being almost Tisha B'Av, and we're thinking about this kind of sinat chinam, right, like this idea that there's this baseless hatred that permeates reality, right, that to me, recognizing that we live in a system that devalues and disenfranchises people that it deems to be different is just also describing the Jewish historical experience. We're inscribed in that system in a different way. To me, recognizing that doesn't say something good or bad about history. It just tells me what happened. It's like being in a family where there's abuse occurring, right? Like having a conversation, not having a conversation about the abuse doesn't make the abuse not have happened. Having a conversation about the abuse can explain the dynamics that are occurring in a family right now. And also, once restorative action happens, once people actually confront that, again, that has to happen over and over, then actually something different can happen, right? That part of Baldwin's argument, for example, is that what Weiss is asking him to do is a thing he's not being allowed to do. He's not allowed to just be a writer. His life is at stake. And I think grappling with that too, right? Confronting that aspect that white Jews can move in and out of that kind of precarity. So we live in this system, we experience this. I mean, at least I've experienced this, right? That kind of disjunction between the way I view the world and the way the world views me, what W.B. Du Bois described as a double consciousness, this anxiety. And if we're going to talk about anti-Semitism on the left, academic spaces can be highly critical. My politics are A+ politics, according to certain leftist spaces, but also the fact that I have to lay those politics out create a kind of separation between me and other people who don't have to lay out those parts of their politics. And we can have a whole conversation about the relationship between the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, and Israel and Palestine. We can go there also. But I think the very first step we need to have is to just kind of recognize all the stuff that happened before now. Does that answer your question a little better?
Yeah, so what I'd like to suggest, we've lost a lot of people who really wanted to hear your lecture. Why don't we wrap up the formal part of this, and then I'll open everyone's mic and we can have an informal discussion.
Great.
After that. So I think Annie wants to say a few last words.
I just want to thank you both, Danny and Craig, for sharing your Torah and your insights and your expertise with us, helping us to reflect, challenging us, lifting up perspective about history, about what's happening right now. And as you referenced, Danny, thinking about this theme of sinat chinam, of the baseless hatred and the damage that it does, especially during this time of the month of Av leading to Tisha B'Av, giving us a space to reflect and think about in what ways, to begin this conversation as well, in what ways we can work together to create a society that looks different, to take apart the systems that are founded on hatred, and to figure out what does it look like to build a society a foundation of ahavat chinam, on a foundation of love that flows in a deeper way. So I thank you for sharing your incredible insights and wisdom with us. And I know that we'll stick around. If you do have to step off now, you can do that. And for others who want to stay on, continue the conversation. And we're so thankful that we have you here until 8:30 to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us, Sue.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, and definitely stick around if you want to. Our time is yours, so we're here for a while if people want to chat. These are hard things.
These are really hard things. It's awful. I mean, it's just awful. The history of white supremacy is terrible. The ideology is terrible. Living in it sucks. We're really fun at parties, though.
Okay, so everyone's ready to unmute. There was one question that I didn't ask, which I've been wanting to ask, which is, are you able to talk a little bit about Portland and who the white nationalists are that are involved there?
Yeah.
A little bit. Do you want to start?
Oh, yeah. So actually, this talk is based on a chapter from this book on ideologies of U.S. foreign policy, which is centered in the Northwest, where my postdoc was. And it's all about Oregon. So Oregon has a clause in its constitution saying that free people of color cannot move to Oregon. And that stays in their constitution from 1859 until 1923. So
and slavery is illegal also.
Oh, yeah. And also
enslavement is illegal. Effectively, no people of color.
So no people of color, because they imagine, because it's like the difference between white supremacy and white nationalism. They imagine a state that's just free, completely free of people of color. And so what's also fascinating about this area, Portland area historically too, is that you have a large Native American population, and then you have a large Asian American population, and actually a historical Black and Jewish community in Portland itself. And then the outer lying areas are kind of a white nationalist enclave, and you can talk to that.
Yeah, and very frontier based because it's the end of the Oregon Trail. And so you really end up with a very kind of pristine white area around it that's very rugged. And then in the cities, it's very, very different in that area. And one of the things that I think really happens that to contextualize what's happening right now in the news, one of the things that happens that's really important is in the late 70s and early 80s, there's a movement of connected to the Sierra Club that starts pushing for a kind of new territory in the Pacific Northwest called Cascadia. And they imagine this kind of independent nation that's going to pull away from the United States and create a kind of eco-friendly landscape and create its own laws and be self-sufficient and get itself off gas and all those kinds of things. And just within a couple years, the Sierra Club is infiltrated by neo-Nazis who very quickly realized that they can create a Pacific Northwestern white ethno-state by promoting the environment. And so you end up with this fusion called ecofascism that comes out of the Pacific Northwest, where you have these really rugged, very rough neo-Nazi groups that start partnering in really kind of awkward, usually secretive ways with groups like the Sierra Club to advance this notion of a separate state. And so sometimes it's called the State of Jefferson, sometimes it's called the Cascadia Project. There's a couple other names, Greater Oregon, but all of these different groups, which are leftist groups that are really trying very hard to create alliances that will be progressive, kind of end up awkwardly voting for the same things as neo-Nazis in that area because of this weird synergy that's developed there.
This is something we didn't get into in the talk, but part of I think the hesitancy to answer the left-right anti-Semitism question is that it's much more like a globe than a line.
Yeah, it's often described as a horseshoe, right? That politics go right and left, and then at the bottom they kind of veer together again a little bit. It's a lopsided horseshoe, but it does come back together a little bit. And then so the thing with the Pacific Northwest to realize is that because it was so attractive in the 70s for neo-Nazi organizations, the Antifa organizations out there have been active since the 70s. This is not a new phenomenon. They've been out there working, struggling, fighting against neo-Nazis on the ground. I went to Oregon for grad school. I had neighbors who were the anarchists that you're seeing on television right now. And they were actually fighting real Nazis in the streets back in the early aughts. And it was a really messy scene. And Portland is the center of it, but it goes down to Eugene and it goes up to Seattle. And it really is a kind of rough zone where people really are dealing with neo-Nazism on a street-to-street basis sometimes. And so it's been a very present part of life out there. And there are some organized hate groups that are connected to the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. They have worked with the police organizations out there. Portland police have called neo-Nazis across the river in Washington and warned them that federal agents were coming to arrest them and that they should clear out. And so Portland also is a place where the police, different police units have actually actively conspired with white nationalists to help them avoid arrest. And they've also taken depositions and things from white nationalists to try and frame and jail Antifa members. And so it really is there's a reason that it's one of the kind of fronts in this fight that's happening, just like Berkeley is for very similar reasons.
There's also something really interesting that happens in Portland specifically. There's an activist named Derek Black who talks about this a lot, which is that Portland area neo-Nazis, and in fact across the board, but he's talking specifically about the Pacific Northwest, are recruiting Black people, Black nationalists on the basis of their anti-Semitism, right? So this is another factor. We didn't talk as much about Black anti-Semitism because I'm trying to change the perspective on that to make it about us, to like reflect in the Jewish anti-Blackness, because I think that's the productive way of having this conversation. But I think it's also really essential that one of the reasons this conversation needs to happen, and out loud and in public, is because nationalism itself historically is white supremacist. I know I sound like a broken record, but it is historically produced to create power for specific white people and ideologically produced in that way. So nationalism in general as a form produces white supremacist structures and anti-Black structures, anti-BIPOC structures. Even if the ideology, the like nationalism is like ethno-nationalist specific, right? So Jewish nationalism has this propensity, Black nationalism has this propensity, Jewish nationalism picks up Islamophobia, Black nationalism picks up anti-Semitism. All of those are expressions of how nationalism functions to promote certain kinds of institutions and certain hierarchical modes of power. And so that's part of the problem, right? When we don't have these conversations, it actually becomes a recruitment mechanism. It's not just about, it's also about alienating people with whom, basically, we often talk about Jews forming kind of this middle structure, but the real issue is that so long as the structures that allows the legal and social fiction of Blackness to exist in its material forms, Jews will always have this precarity. There's no safety so long as the substrata in any society, whether it's race or class or ableism, all of that creates this position where you have a group of people who can move up and down and who are fighting their precarity constantly. And in fighting their precarity are helping maintain that system.
Yeah, and the key with this too, the reason why this borderline is so important, as Hannah Arendt points out, that the explicit component of the totalitarian element in fascism, totalitarianism is about taking those borders and constantly changing them, right, and moving it more and more. And so that you start by focusing on an exterior border, and then all of a sudden, whatever you've trained your police officers to do in a foreign state, you let them do in this state. You move them from that territory to this territory, and it creates a lawless state in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so that's the turn we've seen in Portland this last 2 weeks. And it's partly why people who theorize fascism are so freaked out right now about this shift that's happened around Portland.
Other questions? Phyllis, did you have a question? I saw your hand at some point.
Yes. Craig, you referenced Hillary's term basket of deplorables, and you kind of
Yes.
threw it out and you didn't say, were you ascribing some specific meaning to it? Was Hillary supposedly using this meaning? Was she not using this meaning? She got a lot of criticism and had to apologize for using it. So I wanted to know what you were referring to.
Yes, I was referring to that. She was right, and she was referring to it. So I think the thing. So what she was referring to, from what I understand from reading the kind of FBI briefings and things that have come out of this, she was seeing behind the scenes a great deal of information from the FBI on what the alt-right was doing, using Gamergate figures to target her behind the scenes and to spread conspiracy theories, and usually anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that were centered on her in the larger right-wing community. And what she was seeing was a bunch of data that suggested the numbers were massive. There was a ton of people in the United States, millions and millions of people who were spreading this information, that they were working with Russians. They could actually name specific Russians who are connected to the Gamergate movement who are providing information. And what she was seeing behind the scenes, supposedly, was a great deal of data that really freaked her out. That all of a sudden she was like, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of Americans who are literally into neo-Nazism at this point. And that she came out, from what I've read, she came out in a moment of exasperation and called them a basket of deplorables, and then had to wheel it back because of the political ramifications. But from what I've seen from FBI people talking about it afterward, Daryl Johnson and several others, what they've said is, no, she's right. The statistics bear what she was saying. She was seeing specific data coming in from the organizations, from intelligence, and that demographic information from surveys show that there's a significant portion of people in the United States who back neo-Nazism and aren't afraid of it. And will tell people when they're surveyed that they back neo-Nazi ideas. And so that was what I was referring to. There is a substantial portion of people who I would categorize along with her.
Thank you.
And I think, and I do think that Hillary Clinton is one person to really focus on for this conversation, because if you follow New World Order conspiracy theories, those developed around the Clinton family specifically as a kind of centerpiece. And what they did was the far right simply took the Zionist occupying government conspiracy theory from the 70s, stripped it of its explicit reference to Jews, put Hillary Clinton in that space as a female, as a very loud woman who was conspiring behind the scenes with banks. And basically they took all of these tropes that were connected historically to anti-Semitism, applied them to her, usually connected her online with a bunch of different Jewish figures through her biography. And so she became a kind of touchstone for far-right anti-Semitism. And Russia really activated that because Russia is deep, deep in the anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
They have an explicit neo-Nazi philosophy that Putin has been developing for a long time.
Thank you.
This is really dark stuff when you start to dig into it.
We can talk, if you'd like, we can clarify the Putin part too.
And I can provide sources if people want to follow up with those kinds of things.
Sherilyn Ifill had a really good article in the Washington Post in 2018 about U.S. racism as a national security issue.
Yeah.
So part of what happens too is that Russia historically, and other states, but Russia especially, has used U.S. racism against the United States in terms of like internal agitprop. So in the 2016 election, this is something they've been doing for decades, but in the 2016 election in specific, they both suppressed the African-American vote, Black vote, and also drove the like white supremacist vote for Trump, right? The far right for Trump. And they manipulated the levers that they knew were already there. And that kind of gets to also the structure of anti-Semitism, right? That these levers that exist, and that part of what we want to do when we talk about it is not when anti-Semitism exists in the world that Jews need a specific redress in that moment, but that the reason that you just call it out, you say like, hey, you know, if you characterize even terrible, horrible Jews as demons
or vampires
or bloodsuckers or etc., that like feeds into a thing you do not want it to feed into. It's less about protecting white Jews, for example, from some kind of like fear, and more about decreasing the amount of space and language people on the far right have to mobilize into.
I have a second question. Stephen Miller, you said that the late night shows criticize Stephen Miller and that they are they're inadvertently supporting the anti-Zionists, this anti-Jewish feeling. And yet some of the most ardent critics of Stephen Miller are Jewish people. So
we're not saying don't criticize Stephen Miller. Oh, sorry.
Or are they criticizing, are they, by criticizing Stephen Miller, feeding into the neo-Nazi support for criticizing Stephen Miller? And it's an example of this non-violence. Should they be holding off because they're really creating this again criticism of this feeding this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic image of Stephen Miller, feeding on the enhancing anti-Semitism, and yet the Jewish critics are who were maybe the supporters of immigration, who sincerely believe he's wrong.
Yeah, do you mind if I interject for a second? We're not saying please, everyone criticize Stephen Miller, he's a monster.
Don't call him a monster.
I can call him a monster. That's exactly the point. It's how you do it, right? So there are a lot of ways to criticize Stephen Miller on his policies, on his ideology, on everything he says and does in the world, literally everything. Criticize Stephen Miller. What I'm saying is when you criticize Stephen Miller, you shouldn't use historically anti-Semitic tropes to do so. Just like if you criticize a Black person and you use a trope, right? If you're describing the way someone looks or acts, that's not really a criticism of them and their policies. Does that distinction make sense? So like comparing Stephen Miller to a vampire and saying that he's sucking children's blood is evocative, but it is also very similar to the kinds of imagery that was used historically and that continues to be used to dehumanize Jews. It's very easy to criticize Stephen Miller without calling him a vampire. He's so terrible. Does that make sense?
It does, but still, your statement that by criticizing, you are feeding into this whole non-Jewish people who criticize Stephen Miller, whether on the talk shows, are they not criticizing his policies? And is that what were you referring to, the Stephen Colbert?
Yeah, you got to clarify.
What I'm referring to is the almost endemic propensity to monster him in some kind of way, to first describe him in monstering ways, to draw him with fangs, to show him as a demon, turn him into a bat and make him fly around the screen.
I mean, they do it with Sheldon Adelson. Cartooning the News does that. I mean, Seth Meyers, when he's doing his monologue, will often describe a person in various ways that are very, very funny. This critique is not just a critique that like we have. Also, they do like very ableist things sometimes. Yeah. They criticize Trump's weight or the way he moves. So this is kind of a criticism of the way the left has an image of itself as dismantling certain things. And in fact, the way it goes about dismantling those things reinforces them when they're not reflective.
Yeah, and none of that is to say, again, that Stephen Colbert is anti-Semitic, or none of those kind of personal things are operative here. It's just that my criticism for all of them would be more aware of the history of anti-Semitic tropes. Don't use them. That it's a pretty simple thing. And that's really the criticism.
It's again, we were asked about anti-Semitism on the left, and I think I wish that we had responded with the real focus. We were talking a lot about liberal racism, and anti-Semitism on the left needs to be discussed and addressed without question. But what I am concerned about in this space is that we both address like actually the ways that the left can be operationalized to both fight anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and other forms of inequity, and also focus on like the real danger, which is not like, you know, one of the late night hosts literally demonizing Steven Mnuchin. It's all the things happening on the right now, like children in cages and stormtroopers in Portland.
Yeah, and I think one last thing I would say on that too is just that the other thing that I would want to do is ask what we expect it to do when we criticize Stephen Miller, why we would criticize Stephen Miller as opposed to any other number of people connected to the Trump organization. And so I think the weight
This is
of
where
attention,
we depart a tiny bit.
Yeah, okay, well, I would say the weight of attention given to him is a little bit excessive and could be better spent on some other figures, but
I feel like that's a conversation we can have in 30 years. Like when we just talk about how this happened and historians are looking back, we'll look at how anti-Semitism structured certain figures to come forward. But I don't think we have the distance right now to know if he's paid more or less attention to.
That's fair.
And I'm all for, like, I mean, he's so terrible.
Well, also to be upfront about it too, I don't think that me as a non-Jew criticizing Stephen Miller does the same thing as anyone else who is Jewish criticizing Stephen Miller. That's not my space. That's not my fight. If I do that, I'm being destructive in more ways, I think. So I think it really depends on who you are, what you can kind of leverage in these fights.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Somebody had another question, but I'm not seeing, I can't, because of my contacts, I can't see the chat well.
Rabbi Annie just reminded me that we've got evening starting at 8:30.
Yeah.
So I am going to have to end the class so that we can begin the minion on another channel.
Well, if people want to follow up with email or ask questions, feel free.
We also hold weekly office hours
Oh,
on Sunday afternoons where people show up and we just have free-flowing conversations like this. And it's a little gentler than the lecture, which is hard.
Heavy. Yeah. So you're all welcome if you want to find us on Facebook or email us or something. You're welcome to stop by and ask questions there.
Street, 6 feet away.
Thank you so much, Craig and Danny. This was a wonderful presentation. Very, very interesting.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah.
And your faces.
And your time.
And your time.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Good night.